23rd August 1942, Stalingrad. The sky turned black at midday, not from storm clouds, but from the wings of over 600 Luftwaffe aircraft descending upon the Soviet industrial city like a plague of steel locusts. Junkers Ju-87 Stukas screamed earthward, their sirens wailing the signature howl that had terrorized Europe. Heinkel He-111 bombers released their payloads in rippling cascades. Within minutes, entire city blocks erupted into geysers of flame and debris. Oil storage tanks along the Volga River ruptured, sending rivers of fire across the water's surface. The air itself seemed to ignite. In the streets below, a 19-year-old Red Army private named Vasily pressed himself against the shattered remains of a brick wall, his Mosin Nagant rifle clutched to his chest. The concussive blasts felt like sledgehammers against his ribcage. Dust and ash filled his lungs. He couldn't hear his own screams over the roar of destruction. He didn't know it yet, but he was standing at the epicenter of what would become the most savage battle in human history. A 5-month meat grinder that would consume over 2 million lives and break the back of the German Wehrmacht forever. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from the Second World War. Where are you watching from, and could you have survived what happened in those ruins? To understand why Stalingrad became the graveyard of Hitler's ambitions, we must first understand the strategic context of 1942. By summer of that year, Nazi Germany stood at the absolute zenith of its power. The swastika flew from the Atlantic coast of France to the outskirts of Moscow, from the Arctic Circle of Norway to the scorching deserts of North Africa. The Wehrmacht had conquered an empire larger than anything since Napoleon, and done it in less than 3 years. But beneath the surface of these conquests, cracks had begun to show. Operation Barbarossa, the massive invasion of the Soviet Union, launched on 22 June 1941, had failed to deliver the knockout blow Hitler expected. The Red Army had retreated, yes, but it had not broken. Soviet resistance proved fiercer, more fanatical, and more resourceful than German intelligence had predicted. The vastness of Russia swallowed entire armies. Supply lines stretched to breaking point across primitive roads that became impassable mud rivers in autumn and frozen wastelands in winter. And when winter arrived in December 1941, it came with a vengeance that German soldiers, still wearing summer uniforms, were catastrophically unprepared for. The brutal winter of 1941–42 cost Germany over 750,000 casualties. Frostbite claimed more German soldiers than Soviet bullets. Tank engines froze solid, artillery mechanisms seized. Horses, still the primary means of transport for the Wehrmacht, died by the thousands. The myth of German invincibility, carefully cultivated by Goebbels' propaganda machine, suffered its first serious crack. Soviet counteroffensives pushed German forces back from the gates of Moscow, and for the first time, Hitler's generals began to whisper doubts about ultimate victory. For the 1942 campaign season, Hitler pivoted strategy. Rather than another direct assault on Moscow, he fixated on the south, specifically the oil fields of the Caucasus and the industrial city of Stalingrad on the Volga River. His reasoning was brutally pragmatic. Germany's war machine ran on oil, and Romanian supplies were insufficient for sustained operations. The Soviet oil fields at Baku and Grozny represented the bloodline of the Red Army. Capture them, and Stalin's ability to wage mechanized warfare would collapse. Additionally, Stalingrad, beyond its propaganda value as the city bearing Stalin's name, was a critical transportation hub where the Volga River met key rail lines. Seizing it would sever Soviet north-south communications and open the route to the Caspian Sea.
On 28 June 1942, Operation Blue began. Army Group South split into 2 massive thrusts. Army Group A drove toward the Caucasus oil fields, while Army Group B, spearheaded by General Friedrich Paulus's Sixth Army, was ordered to secure the Don River Bend and capture Stalingrad. The Sixth Army was one of the Wehrmacht's premier formations, battle-hardened from campaigns in Poland, France, and the early victories of Barbarossa. It comprised 13 infantry divisions, 3 motorized divisions, 3 panzer divisions, and supporting units, roughly 270,000 men equipped with the finest weapons German industry could produce. General Paulus himself was a meticulous planner, a former staff officer known for his methodical approach and unwavering adherence to orders. Tall, thin, and aristocratic in bearing, he was more comfortable with maps and logistics than frontline command. But his superiors trusted his competence, and Hitler personally selected him to deliver the prize of Stalingrad. By mid-August, advance units of the Sixth Army reached the outskirts of the city. The Soviets, caught in a desperate situation, rushed reinforcements across the Volga. Stalin issued Order Number 227 on 28 July, a document that would become infamous. "Not one step back," it declared. Commanders who retreated without orders would face courts-martial and execution. Soldiers who deserted would be shot by NKVD blocking detachments positioned behind Soviet lines. The order was brutal, merciless, and effective. Retreat was no longer an option. Stalingrad would be defended to the last man, the last bullet, the last breath. The initial Luftwaffe bombing on 23 August was intended to break Soviet resistance before German ground forces even entered the city. It succeeded only in creating the hell where that resistance would be forged. Over 40,000 Soviet civilians died in a single day. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to burning skeletal frameworks. The tractor factory, which had been converted to produce T-34 tanks, continued operations even as bombs fell around it. Workers welded armor plates onto tank hulls in one section, while another section burned. The tanks would roll directly from the assembly line into combat, sometimes with factory workers still aboard manning the guns. When the German Sixth Army began its ground assault into Stalingrad in early September, soldiers expected to find a demoralized, shattered defense. Instead, they encountered a new kind of warfare, intimate, savage, and utterly unforgiving. The Soviets, under the command of General Vasily Chuikov, had adopted a radical defensive strategy born of desperation and genius. Chuikov was a blunt, profane 52-year-old veteran who understood urban warfare intuitively. He realized that Soviet forces could not match German firepower in open battle. German artillery, Stuka dive bombers, and combined arms tactics would annihilate any conventional defense. But in the ruins of Stalingrad, those advantages evaporated. His strategy was brilliantly simple. Hug the Germans close. Fight them at such close range, sometimes mere meters, that German artillery and air support became useless for fear of hitting their own troops. Turn every building into a fortress. Make them fight for every floor, every room, every staircase. Bleed them white in a grinding war of attrition. The Germans called it Rattenkrieg, rat warfare. Soldiers fought in sewers, in basements, in collapsed buildings where the distinction between floor and ceiling had ceased to exist. Soviet defenders fortified individual structures with mines, barbed wire, and interlocking fields of fire. Snipers, both men and women, positioned themselves in rubble piles and picked off German officers and NCOs with methodical precision. The most famous, Vasily Zaitsev, would claim 225 confirmed kills during the battle, including 11 enemy snipers. The fighting was vertical and three-dimensional. Combat occurred simultaneously in basements, ground floors, upper stories, and rooftops. A German squad might control a room, while Soviet soldiers held the floor above. Grenades were rolled down staircases. Satchel charges were lowered through holes blown in floors. Close combat with bayonets, entrenching tools, and bare hands became commonplace when ammunition ran low. One German soldier wrote in his diary, "We are fighting rats in sewers. Every street is a river of blood. There is no glory here, only death in 1,000 horrible forms." The most iconic defensive position was Pavlov's house, a 4-story apartment building that became a symbol of Soviet resistance. Sergeant Yakov Pavlov and a platoon of fewer than 30 men fortified the building and held it for 58 days against repeated German assaults. They mined the approaches, knocked holes in walls to create firing positions, and established a supply line through the basement to Soviet positions in the rear. German commanders threw company after company against the building. All failed. More Germans died trying to take Pavlov's house than had died taking Paris. September brought no respite, only intensified horror. German forces pushed deeper into the city, capturing the central railway station on 14th September after vicious fighting. The station changed hands 15 times in a single day, each side launching counterattacks almost immediately after being driven out. The platforms became a charnel house, bodies stacked like cordwood, blood pooling in shell craters, the smell of death so thick it was almost visible. The Soviets employed a desperate expedient. They ferried reinforcements across the Volga River at night under German artillery fire. These crossings were nightmarish ordeals. Barges and small boats, overloaded with soldiers, crossed under a hail of shells and machine gun fire. Many vessels were hit and sank, taking hundreds of men down into the dark waters. Those who made it across often had only hours to live. The average life expectancy of a newly arrived Soviet soldier in Stalingrad was 24 hours. Some units were effectively destroyed within their first day of combat. Yet they kept coming. Stalin had declared Stalingrad the symbolic heart of Soviet resistance, and reinforcements, however poorly equipped, continued flowing into the city. Many soldiers crossed the river with only a rifle and 20 rounds of ammunition. They were told to scavenge weapons from the dead. Officers who questioned these tactics were removed. The NKVD blocking detachments ensured that retreat remained more dangerous than advance. The Germans, meanwhile, struggled with every meter of progress. The Sixth Army had been trained for blitzkrieg, rapid mobile warfare across open terrain. Urban combat in ruins negated every tactical advantage they possessed. Panzers, fearsome in open country, became death traps in narrow streets where Soviet anti-tank teams could approach from multiple directions. The Luftwaffe, which had dominated European skies, found its effectiveness drastically reduced. Bombing the city further only created more rubble, more places for defenders to hide. By early October, German forces controlled roughly 90% of the city. They held the Central District, the railway station, the Barakati gun factory, the Red October steel plant, and most residential areas. Paulus reported to Hitler that final victory was imminent, perhaps days away. But that final 10%, clinging to narrow strips along the Volga's western bank, refused to die. Chuikov's command post was literally carved into the riverbank, so close to the front line that German grenades sometimes rolled down the embankment toward it. The October fighting reached a crescendo of violence that defied human endurance. The Germans launched massive assaults on the factory districts, massive industrial complexes that had become fortress labyrinths. The fighting in the tractor factory saw entire Soviet battalions annihilated, only to be replaced the next night by fresh units ferried across the river. German casualties mounted relentlessly, 50,000 by mid-October. Replacements arrived poorly trained and were thrown immediately into the meat grinder. Ammunition consumption reached levels that stressed the entire German logistical system. And then came winter. The first snows dusted the ruins in late October. Temperatures began dropping. German soldiers, many still wearing the same summer uniforms they'd worn in June, began suffering from exposure. Frostbite cases multiplied. The supply situation, already precarious, deteriorated further as roads became impassable. Horses died in harness. Vehicles froze. The men fighting in Stalingrad's ruins were exhausted, traumatized, and increasingly aware that something had gone terribly wrong.
While German attention remained fixated on the grinding, incremental battle in Stalingrad's ruins, Soviet High Command prepared a masterstroke. General Georgy Zhukov, arguably the greatest operational commander of the Second World War, had been studying the strategic situation with cold, analytical precision. He recognized that the German salient into Stalingrad created a massive vulnerability. The flanks were held by Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian armies, Germany's allies, but poorly equipped, inadequately trained, and with questionable morale. Zhukov conceived Operation Uranus, a massive double envelopment designed to cut off and destroy the entire Sixth Army. The plan called for simultaneous attacks north and south of Stalingrad, breaking through the Axis satellite armies and linking up deep in the German rear. It was audacious, complex, and required meticulous coordination of over 1 million troops, 13,500 heavy guns, 900 tanks, and 1,400 aircraft. The Soviets assembled their forces in absolute secrecy. Units moved at night, camouflaged during the day. Radio silence was strictly enforced. Dummy positions and dummy traffic deceived German aerial reconnaissance. By mid-November, everything was in place. The jaws of the trap were open. The Sixth Army, still battering itself against Stalingrad's final defenders, suspected nothing. At 0730 hours on 19th November 1942, the northern attack erupted. Over 3,500 Soviet guns opened fire along an 80-mile front held by the Romanian Third Army. The barrage lasted 80 minutes and was so intense that entire Romanian divisions simply disintegrated. Survivors described a vision of hell, the earth itself seeming to explode upward, men buried alive or blown to fragments, communications instantly severed. Then came the tanks, hundreds of T-34s and T-70s surging forward through fog and snow, their treads churning the frozen ground into bloody mud. The Romanian defenses collapsed within hours. Entire divisions surrendered or fled in panic. German units rushed to plug the gaps, but were overwhelmed by the speed and violence of the Soviet assault. By nightfall on 19th November, Soviet mechanized columns had penetrated 50 kilometers behind German lines and were racing westward toward the Don River crossings. The next day, 20th November, the southern pincer struck. The Romanian Fourth Army and German Fourth Panzer Army positions south of Stalingrad faced the same overwhelming onslaught. The pattern repeated. Devastating artillery preparation, then massed tank assault, then exploitation deep into the rear. German commanders realized the danger, but lacked the reserves to contain it. Every available unit had been committed to Stalingrad fighting. On 23rd November, the two Soviet pincers met near the town of Kalach on the Don, 40 miles west of Stalingrad. The ring closed. Inside the pocket, the entire Sixth Army, over 290,000 men, plus elements of the 4th Panzer Army, 2 Romanian divisions, and various support units. It was the largest operational encirclement in military history. The immediate reaction among German commanders was to break out immediately. General Paulus requested permission to abandon Stalingrad and fight westward while a corridor might still be forced open. His staff calculated they had perhaps 72 hours before Soviet forces consolidated the encirclement. Every hour of delay meant Soviet reinforcements strengthening the ring, digging anti-tank ditches, laying minefields, positioning artillery. But Hitler refused. Influenced by Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring's assurance that the Luftwaffe could supply the pocket by air, and convinced that retreat would mean abandoning the entire Caucasus campaign, Hitler issued an order. The 6th Army would hold Stalingrad, no retreat. Reinforcements would break through from outside. The airlift would sustain them. It was a decision built on fantasy and would doom an entire army. The 6th Army required approximately 750 tons of supplies daily: food, ammunition, fuel, medical supplies, winter clothing, just to survive, let alone continue fighting. Göring promised to deliver it. The Luftwaffe never came close.
The airlift operation was doomed from the start. The Luftwaffe's primary transport aircraft, the Junkers Ju-52, was a slow, lumbering 3-engine design from the 1930s, completely inadequate for sustained operations in hostile airspace and winter weather. The pocket had only a few makeshift airstrips that deteriorated rapidly under heavy use and bad weather. Soviet fighters, Yak-1s, Lag-3s, and MiG-3s prowled the air corridors, shooting down transports with ease. Anti-aircraft artillery ringed the pocket. Blizzards grounded entire squadrons for days at a time. The best single-day delivery totaled approximately 300 tons, less than half the minimum requirement. Most days, the figure was far lower. Transport crews displayed extraordinary courage, flying through storms and anti-aircraft fire, but courage could not overcome logistical impossibility. Wounded men lay on frozen airstrips, waiting for evacuation flights that never came, freezing to death within sight of the aircraft they'd hoped would save them. Inside the pocket, conditions deteriorated rapidly. Rations were cut repeatedly, first to half portions, then quarter portions, then even less. By December, soldiers were receiving 200 grams of bread per day, supplemented by thin soup. Horses were slaughtered and eaten. Leather belts were boiled for their minimal nutritional value. Men began dying not from combat, but from starvation, exposure, and disease. December brought temperatures plunging below -30 degrees Celsius. German soldiers, still lacking adequate winter clothing, suffered mass frostbite casualties. Entire companies became combat ineffective not from enemy action, but from cold. Dysentery and typhus spread through overcrowded bunkers. Medical supplies ran out. Surgeons performed amputations without anesthesia. The wounded lay in frozen cellars, their groans becoming progressively weaker until they stopped altogether. A relief operation, Operation Winter Storm, launched on 12 December under Field Marshal Erich von Manstein. His 4th Panzer Army, hastily assembled from units scraped together across southern Russia, drove northeast toward the pocket. The attack made initial progress, fighting through desperate Soviet resistance. By 19th December, the relief force had closed to within 35 miles of the pocket perimeter. German soldiers inside the Kessel could hear the distant rumble of artillery and dared to hope. Paulus requested permission to break out toward the relief force. Hitler again refused. The 6th Army must hold Stalingrad. Manstein's forces, threatened by Soviet counterattacks and lacking the strength to both hold ground and push forward, stalled. Then, Soviet forces launched new offensives, threatening to encircle Manstein's entire army group. By Christmas, Operation Winter Storm had failed. The relief force retreated. Hope died. Christmas 1942 in the Stalingrad pocket was a descent into the final circle of hell. German soldiers huddled in frozen bunkers, burning furniture, documents, anything combustible for a few moments of warmth. Christmas rations consisted of watery soup made from horse bones and 100 grams of bread. Officers tried to maintain morale with speeches about duty and sacrifice. Few men listened. They knew they were abandoned, left to die for Hitler's refusal to admit defeat. December 1943 brought the end. Soviet forces launched Operation Ring on 10th January, a systematic crushing operation designed to compress and destroy the pocket in segments. Artillery barrages of unimaginable intensity preceded each assault. Soviet infantry and tanks advanced through blizzards against defenders too weak to resist effectively. German units, reduced to skeleton strength, fought with the desperation of the doomed. Some positions held until annihilated, others collapsed immediately. The pocket shrank day by day. By mid-January, the Potomnik airfield, the last major landing strip, fell to Soviet forces. The airlift, already pathetic, became nearly non-existent. Wounded could no longer be evacuated. They lay in improvised hospitals without heat, medicine, or hope, waiting to die. On 22nd January, Soviet forces split the pocket in two. The southern group, containing Paulus's headquarters, was isolated from the northern group. Communication between the two sectors became sporadic, then impossible. Each pocket now fought its own lonely battle.
Hitler, in a final cynical gesture, promoted Paulus to field marshal on 30th January, the 10th anniversary of the Nazi seizure of power. The message was unmistakable. No German field marshal had ever surrendered. Paulus was expected to commit suicide rather than capitulate, providing a dramatic martyrdom for propaganda purposes. But Paulus, emaciated and lice-ridden, had no intention of theatrical suicide. On 31st January, Soviet troops stormed his headquarters in the basement of the Univermag department store. Paulus surrendered the southern pocket. The northern pocket, under General Karl Strecker, fought on until 2nd February, before finally laying down arms. The statistics were apocalyptic. Of approximately 290,000 Axis troops encircled in November, roughly 91,000 marched into Soviet captivity, most so weak from starvation and disease they could barely walk. Only 6,000 would ever return to Germany, most not until the 1950s, after years in Soviet labor camps. The remainder, nearly 200,000 men, died in the pocket from combat, starvation, disease, or cold. Soviet casualties across the entire Stalingrad campaign exceeded 1 million killed, wounded, or missing. The city itself no longer existed, only square miles of rubble containing frozen corpses beyond counting. Stalingrad was more than a battle. It was the strategic turning point of the Second World War in Europe. Before Stalingrad, Germany could still plausibly claim the possibility of victory. After Stalingrad, that possibility vanished into the frozen ruins along the Volga. The psychological impact reverberated across the world. In Berlin, Goebbels declared 3 days of national mourning. Black-bordered casualty notices appeared in newspapers. The myth of German invincibility, carefully constructed over years of conquest, shattered irreparably. Throughout occupied Europe, resistance movements took heart. In London and Washington, Allied strategists recognized that Germany had been dealt a mortal wound. But the most profound impact was military and strategic.
The Sixth Army represented not just 290,000 men, but an irreplaceable cadre of experienced officers, NCOs, and specialists. Germany's subsequent attempts to stabilize the Eastern Front at Kursk, across Ukraine, in countless defensive battles, were hampered by this loss of institutional expertise. Divisions were rebuilt on paper, but lacked the combat-hardened leadership that had made the Wehrmacht so formidable. More critically, Stalingrad marked the moment when strategic initiative passed permanently to the Soviets. Before Stalingrad, Germany chose when and where to attack. After Stalingrad, that choice belonged to the Red Army. Soviet offensives throughout 1943 and 1944 drove the Wehrmacht westward in a grinding retreat that would end only in Berlin's ruins. The battle also validated Soviet defensive doctrine and urban warfare tactics that would influence military thinking for decades. The concept of defense in depth, the transformation of cities into fortresses, the combined arms at close range, all were refined in Stalingrad's crucible. Future battles, Budapest, Berlin, countless others, would echo the lessons learned in those blood-soaked ruins. For the soldiers who fought there, Stalingrad transcended military history and entered the realm of myth. German veterans spoke of it in hushed tones, if they spoke of it at all, a trauma so profound it resisted words. Soviet veterans remembered it with grim pride, the place where the Red Army proved it could not only survive, but prevail against the Wehrmacht's best. The city became a symbol, for Germany of hubris and catastrophic defeat, for the Soviet Union of sacrifice and ultimate victory.
In that basement on 31st January 1943, as Field Marshal Paulus signed the surrender documents with trembling hands, he closed more than a battle. He closed a chapter of human history written in blood and ash. The young Soviet private who had pressed himself against the rubble on 23rd August as bombs fell around him, if he survived, emerged from 5 months of hell, forever changed. The German soldier who had marched confidently into the city in September, if he survived, learned that will alone cannot overcome geography, logistics, and the determined resistance of an enemy fighting for survival. Stalingrad broke Hitler's army not through a single decisive stroke, but through attrition so comprehensive, so grinding, so total that the Wehrmacht never recovered. Every subsequent German defeat, Kursk, Bagration, the retreat across Poland, the final collapse into Berlin, traced its lineage to those frozen ruins on the Volga. The Sixth Army's destruction created a gap in German military capability that could never be filled, a loss of momentum that could never be regained. The human cost defied comprehension. Over 2 million casualties, dead, wounded, missing in 5 months of fighting. Entire generations wiped out, families destroyed, a city erased from the map. The Volga River, witnesses claimed, ran red with blood. Bodies lay frozen in the ruins until spring thaws revealed the full magnitude of the carnage. Yet from that carnage emerged a clear truth. Nazi Germany could be beaten. The Wehrmacht, which had conquered a continent, could be stopped, encircled, and destroyed. The war would continue for 2 more years, consuming millions more lives, but Stalingrad marked the moment when Germany's defeat became inevitable. Every step the Wehrmacht took westward after February 1943 was a step toward Berlin and oblivion. On that frozen Volga riverbank where Vasily pressed himself against rubble as the first bombs fell, a battle began that would consume armies and reshape the world. 5 months later, when the guns finally fell silent, over 2 million men had become casualties in the most savage battle in human history. The Wehrmacht, Hitler's supposedly invincible war machine, lay broken in the ruins.
The tide had turned irreversibly. Germany would retreat for 2 years across 1,000 miles until Soviet soldiers raised the red flag over the Reichstag in Berlin. Stalingrad was where Germany's dreams of empire died, and where the Red Army proved it could not just survive, but triumph. The young soldiers who fought in those ruins, German and Soviet alike, paid the ultimate price for their leaders' decisions. They deserved better than to die in a frozen wasteland for ideologies that saw them as expendable. But their sacrifice determined the course of history and ensured that Nazi Germany's reign would end not in 1,000 years, but in 12. But while Stalingrad raged in the east, another crucial battle was unfolding in the Pacific, a struggle just as desperate and just as consequential. Join us next time as we uncover the story of Guadalcanal, where American Marines and Japanese forces fought for 6 months in the jungle hell of the Solomon Islands in a battle that would determine the fate of the Pacific War.